Welcome back to Southeast Asia Radio. Today, we'll be covering former Philippine President Rodrigo Duterte running for mayor and how Southeast Asian nations are rushing to evacuate their citizens as the Middle East conflict escalates.
We'll also be covering how the Chinese online e-commerce site, Temu, is being banned in Indonesia. I'm Japhet and
And I'm Lauren Mai. Today is October 17th, 2024. Last week, Laos hosted the ASEAN Summit. But what were the key takeaways? Greg and Elina were joined by Susannah Patton to cover last week's meetings. But before that, let's start with our headlines. Let's start off in Indonesia, where Chinese online e-commerce giant Temu has been banned.
Yes, Temu, known for their incredible selection of items at insanely low prices. You could furnish a whole house with items from Temu alone.
And that's the fear that the Indonesian authorities have. They are afraid that the entrance of cheap products from Temu flooding the market would severely impact domestic small and medium-sized businesses.
Fair enough. On October 11th, it was reported that Indonesia had asked Google and Apple to block the app from their app stores to prevent downloads. Temu's business model of direct factory-to-consumer sales was described by Communications Minister Budi Ari Setiadi as unhealthy competition. Lauren, does this sound familiar to you?
Actually, yes. It's reminding me of how Indonesia also banned TikTok Shop last year over similar fears that it would threaten local businesses. Critics of these bans, however, pointed out that other platforms, such as Shopee and Tokopedia, have also disrupted traditional commerce and yet have not been banned.
In any case, friends in other Southeast Asian countries can now look forward to shopping on Temu. It was even announced a few days ago that the app would be expanding into Vietnam and Brunei. Happy shopping!
On to our next story, big news from the Philippines. Former President Rodrigo Duterte is running for mayor of Davao City again. He's trying to reclaim the position that launched his career.
Yep, the man who once led the Philippines as president is eyeing a political comeback, but this time he's going back to his roots in local politics. All eyes are on him now that he's making a move in Davao.
Exactly, and it's especially interesting because Duterte was Davao's mayor for over 2 decades before he became president. He built his reputation there with his heavy-handed approach to crime, which sparked both support and criticism, especially internationally.
Right. His war on drugs became notorious during his presidency, and it's still a huge point of controversy. But this election isn't just about him. His political dynasty is facing a bit of a test. His daughter Sarah has made her own waves on the national stage, but the family's dominance in Davao is being questioned.
That's true. While Duterte is a powerful figure, his family's political hold on Davao is no longer a sure thing. There's competition now. People are wondering whether the locals in Davao still feel that the Duterte brand is what they need after all of these years.
The challenge for Duterte will be to prove that he's still relevant and that his leadership can adapt to today's Davao.
And let's not forget the drama between him and the current president, Ferdinand Marcos Jr. Their relationship is complicated to say the least, and Duterte has criticized Marcos's policies. How this dynamic will play out in the election could be very fascinating to watch.
Totally. It's almost like a political soap opera. I wonder if this election's more than just about the mayor's seat.
I could definitely see that. And let's not forget that the International Criminal Court is still investigating Duterte over his war on drugs. There's a cloud hanging over him, and while his supporters might not be fazed by it, it's bound to play a role in how the broader public views his comeback.
Exactly right. Duterte's return to Davao politics is more than just about local governance. It's a test of how much influence he and his family still hold, and whether the people of Davao, and the rest of the country, are ready for another chapter of Duterte rule, or if they're ready to turn the page.
We'll definitely be keeping an eye on this one.
Up next, the Middle East conflict is intensifying, and countries across Asia are working rapidly to evacuate their nationals from the region. The escalating violence in Lebanon and surrounding areas is raising alarms for many Southeast Asian governments.
That's right. The conflict, which has seen rising tensions between Israel and Hezbollah forces based in Lebanon, has put thousands of foreign nationals at risk. Lebanon's proximity to Israel and its complex political situation, with Iran-backed Hezbollah operating in the region, has made it a flashpoint in the ongoing conflict. Governments in Southeast Asia are now acting swiftly to evacuate their citizens. Philippine President Ferdinand Marcos Jr. has ordered the evacuation of Filipinos in Lebanon by whatever means necessary.
And they're moving quickly. Over 180 Filipinos are expected to return home soon, with the Philippine government taking decisive steps to get their people out. Lebanon has long been a destination for Filipino workers, and the volatile situation has put many of them in harm's way.
The situation is similar for Indonesia. President Joko Widodo has also ordered the immediate evacuation of Indonesians in Lebanon. The Indonesian embassy in Beirut has been actively coordinating with local authorities to ensure the safe passage of its citizens amid the escalating violence.
Malaysia, too, is deeply concerned. The Malaysian government is calling for an immediate de-escalation of the conflict and is closely monitoring its nationals in the Middle East. They are prepared to evacuate Malaysians if the situation worsens. Malaysia has also joined international calls for peace, emphasizing the need for restraint and dialogue to prevent further bloodshed.
The urgency across the region highlights the severity of the situation. Countries like South Korea and Australia are also evacuating their nationals as tensions continue to rise. The conflict in Lebanon, coupled with the broader regional instability, is pushing governments to act fast.
It's a critical moment. These countries are doing everything they can to ensure the safety of their citizens, but the situation on the ground remains unpredictable, and the risk of the conflict spreading further is very real.
Let's hope for a peaceful resolution soon and safe evacuations of those impacted. For now, the focus is on getting people out safely and quickly.
And that wraps up our headlines for today. If we missed anything you wanted to hear about, do write us at scaradio@csis.org, and we'll get back to you. Up next, Greg and Elina's conversation with Susannah Patton. Stay tuned.
Welcome back to another Southeast Asia Radio. As always, I'm Greg Poling with the Center for Strategic and International Studies, joined by Elina Noor of the Carnegie Endowment. Hey, Elina.
Hey, Greg.
Where are you coming to us from?
A secret location out in the Pacific.
Somewhere out in the Pacific. And on a third, also difficult time zone, we're joined today by Susannah Patton, who directs the Southeast Asia program at Lowy. And Susannah's back after, I think, 2 years on the podcast. So thanks for joining so darn early in the morning, Susannah.
No worries. Hi, Greg. Hi, Elina.
Welcome back, Susannah.
Yeah, this Southeast Asia directors power trio here. There's not that many of us. If all three of us are here, who's running the only other Southeast Asia programs at any think tank? So we've got Susannah on to talk about the annual ASEAN Summit and the myriad side summits, US ASEAN, China ASEAN, Australia ASEAN, and East Asia Summit. Susannah wrote a piece for Lowy Interpreter published last week, Susannah, about how nice and relaxing it is that the ASEAN Summit's coming and nothing will happen, and isn't that refreshing given all the turmoil in the world, which I actually found to be the most zen take I've ever heard about ASEAN. It almost made me feel bad for writing a commentary that kind of said the US president has better things to do. So first, why don't you defend your piece? Why is ASEAN so relaxing?
Well, I think the context for this piece was that this year's summit seemed like some of the most uneventful, and, there seems to be the least kind of expectation around substantive progress in the organization that I can recall for quite a while. I think that's a reflection of a few things. One is the fact that Laos is in the chair. And of course, when you have a small chair, then you have a lower expectation about new initiatives. The other factor is, I think, just how intractable a lot of the international conflicts are that come onto the ASEAN agenda. So most notably, obviously, South China Sea and Myanmar, but then also the ripple effects from broader global conflicts also coming home to roost when ASEAN engages with its dialogue partners at the East Asia Summit. And then finally, the fact that we have these sort of political transitions which are unfolding in the United States and in Indonesia means that there's a sort of feeling of hiatus at the moment. And so I think for this year's ASEAN summits, I don't know if you've had the same when you were asked by journalists, so what's on the agenda? What's the expectation? I found it a really hard question to answer just because there is so little expectation. But I do want to make it clear I'm a big ASEAN fan. I've got in trouble in the past for what I thought were sort of gently whimsical takes on sort of some of the ASEAN way, but I'm a big fan. I think the region would be a much worse place without ASEAN. I don't think we should lose sight of that, even though it can sometimes be hard to say, well, what have they actually achieved? If you imagine a region without ASEAN, that's a much worse region for Southeast Asian countries and much, much worse also, I would argue, for the United States and for other countries like Australia and Japan. And so that, I guess, that's context for why I think that the other countries should support ASEAN, should attend its summits, because by supporting and by attending, we boost it. And by not attending, we allow it to continue to be diminished.
We should record a warning, like an automated warning before this episode that says all three of the speakers love ASEAN, want ASEAN to continue. Nothing you're about to hear should be taken to mean that ASEAN is irrelevant.
Well, the thing that I was going to say that what I got called out for before was I posted on Twitter a couple of years ago when I landed in an airport, and it was in Manila, and there was a sign, ASEAN Navy Chiefs Conference, welcome to Manila. And I thought it was interesting because, almost every time you land in any ASEAN city, any city in any ASEAN country at any time of the year, there will almost always invariably be an ASEAN meeting happening at that time, just because that's the maths of an organization that holds 1,200 meetings a year. And I posted that, and someone commented, if you truly understood ASEAN community building, then you wouldn't be making fun of this. I was like, I like it. I think it's great.
I think that's just a function of Twitter, Susannah.
No, I don't take it to heart, but that does make me think I just need to be clear that, I'm an ASEAN fan.
I love these caveats. I mean, as someone from the region, I feel like there's a lot more skepticism about ASEAN from within Southeast Asia. So I appreciate the love that's being articulated for ASEAN. But, going back to your Zen-like piece, Susannah, I think that's very on brand for you. You're a very Zen person in general. So I wouldn't have expected any drama from your pieces. And I think it does show, from your writings, how you're very supportive of ASEAN. And you're actually one of the few out there who present a balanced view of ASEAN from outside Southeast Asia. But I guess I wanted to ask you about, I was going to ask you, what you're expecting from the summit with Laos in the chair position, but you've already sort of nixed that. I wanted to get your take, though, on how you see ASEAN now in general, because whoever's in the chair position, there's going to be a ton of analysis about whether the chair or ASEAN in general is doing enough, whether it's Laos or whether it's a bigger country like Indonesia. A lot of expectations of Malaysia now coming shortly after Laos in the chair position. It doesn't matter who's leading ASEAN that year. There's always going to be some commentary about ASEAN's shortcomings. Do you think that's fair, and is that a reflection of where ASEAN is right now, or do you have a more optimistic view of the grouping in general?
Yeah, I think it's fair to say that ASEAN has less ability now than it had in the past to address thorny issues. And I think we can put that down to a couple of factors. One, I think, is just the intractability of some of the issues that are on the agenda. I mean, the Myanmar crisis is the very obvious one, where ASEAN, I think, in many ways, sort of unfairly is blamed for not being able to resolve the crisis. It's not something that ASEAN was ever going to be able to do, but I think that having a crisis of that nature in one of the member countries, I think, and having competing views among the other members about how to deal with that has definitely weakened the group. And I think it's, for some external partners as well, the fact that, Myanmar attended this year's summit at an official level, not at the political level, but, it's been attending the foreign ministers' meetings this year as well. That kind of tarnishes the group for some. And then, again, on South China Sea, I think ever since 2012, when the group really split in that very visible way in Cambodia, there's been a pretty clear understanding among the members about what they can expect from each other. And I think that's one explanation for why the group hasn't split again since then, is the Philippines knows what it can expect from Cambodia and Laos. And Cambodia and Laos know what the Philippines needs at a minimum, maybe in the summit statement language, but they're also not willing to go further in support of the Philippines. And actually, I think, talking to officials in the region, it's striking the level of sort of hostility to the Philippines, in particular for its South China Sea policies. So I think that gulf is very big. And then more broadly, I guess there are questions around sort of the changing kind of regional landscape and the emergence of other diplomatic groupings that I think just by definition do crowd out some of ASEAN's kind of agenda setting space, groups like the Quad. Now, they're not mutually exclusive, and I don't buy the argument that the Quad undermines ASEAN centrality, or whatever that is. That's probably a whole conversation we don't want to go into. But for sure, the emergence of groups like the Quad that didn't exist, or weren't active a decade ago, means that ASEAN doesn't have the kind of uncontested role in the region's diplomacy that it used to.
I think that the fact that all we expect from ASEAN is what we're going to get this week, that the big announcement on Myanmar was that Prime Minister Phay Tongtan announced that she's willing to have an informal talk in Bangkok in December. Like, that hasn't happened every month for the last 3 years. That's the big announcement. On the South China Sea, Marcos said we should get a code of conduct soon, and everybody else said, yeah, we sure should. Like, the lack of ambition is quite telling. And I don't know if we track that to 2012. I don't know if it's because of the South China Sea, if it's just because of a series of relatively weak secretary generals, if it's because we haven't had senior political leadership in a lot of the big countries, most notably Indonesia, for more than a decade. But it doesn't feel like ASEAN expects much of itself when it goes into these meetings. And many of the member states, most especially the Philippines, therefore say, okay, then we're going to take our business elsewhere. We're going to go look to other allies in the Quad. And they're not mutually exclusive because ASEAN isn't really trying to do anything on a lot of these issues. So whatever ASEAN centrality meant 10 years ago, I don't think it means the same thing today. I think the vast majority of ASEAN governments are perfectly happy to kind of behind closed doors say, yeah, we don't want to deal with the South China Sea. We don't want to deal with the crisis in Myanmar. When we say ASEAN centrality, we don't mean on the hard stuff.
Yeah, I think that's fair. And I think, clearly with the Philippines, it's right to say that they've made partnerships outside ASEAN a more important component of their diplomacy. They still have to be seen to be going through the processes with ASEAN. They still have to be seen to be supporting ASEAN diplomacy, because that is, I think, a narrative that is damaging to the Philippines, that they don't consult their neighbours and that they're not sort of fully engaged in those processes, because that really exacerbates the perception of the Philippines being diplomatically isolated, which is not, I think, in the Philippines' interests. But yeah, for sure, Indonesia not being fully engaged, I think, has been a problem for the grouping. It's interesting that a lot of attention has been on the US president not attending this year's summit, but the outgoing Indonesian president Jokowi also not attending, which I guess the fact that his sort of interest in the group has been somewhat episodic. And, Prabowo, I think everyone will expect him to take a more active role on the sort of the regional stage, but where ASEAN will fit within that hierarchy compared with other groupings that position Indonesia more clearly as a sort of leading global country like the G20, I think is an open question.
But I think all these criticisms about ASEAN on the political security side are valid. But don't you think we're doing a disservice to ASEAN by not taking into account the other pillars of the community? I mean, it's part of community building as well. So, we're focused on these issues because these are the issues that we're interested in, maybe, I don't know. But for the economists out there, for the people doing business, what really counts is an initiative like RCEP, for example, or, a lot of the cross-border digital payment stuff that's coming online. Those are some really interesting developments about ASEAN that I guess people like us in the foreign policy and security community tend to not consider as much. And so we put a lot of the failings and weaknesses of ASEAN on the South China Sea, on the Myanmar issue, because it seems both these issues in particular seem intractable. But there's lots of progress that's been made on other fronts.
No, that's 100% true. And I mean, RCEP is such an interesting example of where ASEAN really moved a lot faster than anyone expected. So in sort of RCEP was launched at the end of 2011. And at that point, ASEAN had been tossing up between two competing proposals for regional economic integration, one from China and one from Japan. And they'd been going around and around in circles with different study groups and studying for ages. And, at that time, I was working on these issues in the Australian government, and we thought the best scenario was that, that we would just keep the Japan proposal for a more inclusive grouping alive. We didn't think that ASEAN was going to move that quickly. And then when TPP happened, they really moved. And they launched RCEP very quickly. And then the negotiations got bogged down for more than a decade, which was not an example of ASEAN moving quickly, but it did move quickly when it thought that there was a need. And I think on those economic issues, there is a lot to be proud of. And that is an area where ASEAN is still kind of attractive to external partners. And if you read the statement, which I was just looking at by the Chinese premier at the China ASEAN Summit this year, it's all about the economics, the upgrade of the China ASEAN FTA. And, there's a very clear narrative there about what those countries can do together.
To be fair, I think the bogging down of RCEP was not all ASEAN's fault. It was some of the external partners that were holding back the negotiations as well.
Yes.
These things aren't mutually exclusive, though. And too often we do get trapped in this, maximalist argument. Either you're all in on supporting ASEAN centrality or you're an ASEAN skeptic. I want to be both. How about that? ASEAN remains a vital, vehicle for intra-regional economic integration. That's what it's best at. It's a okay vehicle for intra-regional, sociocultural community building. But the US and China and Japan, they weren't the ones that declared in the mid-90s that ASEAN should be central to political and security issues in the region. They're not the ones that established the ARF and the +1 formats and then eventually the EAS. And they're not the ones who said that ASEAN's vision for the future rested on 3 co-equal communities, one of which is political and security communities. So ASEAN has, at least at the leaders level, the annual summitry has fallen victim to ASEAN's own inflated ambitions from the mid-90s through the late aughts. And we can say that project has underdelivered and still say that ASEAN has been a great vehicle for labor mobility and reduction in, non-tariff barriers. Those two things can both be true.
Yes, those things can be true. I mean, I'm not sure actually that ASEAN has been a great vehicle for labor mobility or for, the ASEAN economic community is a bit of a fiction. If you talk to anyone who tries to, export or import between two ASEAN countries, there's a whole sort of question around narrative and reality when it comes to the economic community as well. I think for me, the broader point about the political security agenda is really what I started out with, which is what's the alternative? If you don't have ASEAN as a grouping, which helps, I think, shape the foreign policies of each of the countries so that they have to take into account their neighbours' interests in what they do, then it would be a much more favourable region for China, in my opinion, because without the shaping effect of ASEAN and the fact that to a certain extent they do all have to stick together to some common lines, granted maybe not as ambitious, not as cohesive as, as many would like, but that is still an important effect, and I think it's worth supporting to the extent that outsiders can.
So I almost don't want to bring it up because I'm so tired of hearing about who's going to be attending the summit and who's not. And I think there's an
Do it. Get mad at Putin for not being there.
Well, if Malaysia has its way, next year he will be there, either virtually or in person. But I almost think that it's not worth having this discussion anymore about whether the US president will be there or not. And I know, Greg, you put something out on this. Why is it that the US gets so much focus on whether the president is attending or not every single year? It just really bugs me that ASEAN commentators, present company excluded, spend so much time hand-wringing about this issue. And nobody really pays attention to the other leaders who are going to be at the summit. Do you share this view, Susannah?
I think that I probably agree with you and Greg a fair bit about this, because I do think that the US has already set a lower expectation for its attendance, and it's just done that in a kind of de facto way. So during the Obama administration, the expectation was set that the US president would attend. And then when the US president didn't attend, then that was big news. I actually think this year there has been some hand-wringing about the fact that Biden's not going to be there, but not as much as in previous years. And I think that does reflect that over the years of the Trump administration and also this administration, that a new expectation has been set that the US will sometimes, but not always, attend at the presidential level. Look, that's probably just realistic. It is a missed opportunity. It does mean that the US doesn't have the same level of ability to influence discussions, to engage with others at the leader level. There's no real substitute for that. The vice president's not a real, I don't think the vice president is regarded as a great substitute for the president normally. I don't think the Secretary of State is a great substitute, better than the National Security Advisor, as we had during the Trump years. So to me, it's a missed opportunity. It's not the end of the world. It's a missed opportunity for the US. I don't think ASEAN should be too concerned about it, though.
I like the phrasing of opportunity because the president is one person. We don't have a premier. We don't have, 4 nominally co-equal leaders like Vietnam. We've got one person, and then they are constrained by the realities of space-time. And so there are opportunity costs. If the president's at an ASEAN summit, they're not doing something else. And that reality is just going to mean that because of all the reasons we've talked about and just the sheer distances, it is unrealistic to expect any U.S. president to attend all the ASEAN and East Asia summits during their time in office. If Obama didn't do it, nobody ever will, because you're not going to get another president that embeds ASEAN so deeply in their Asia strategy again. Again, because of some disappointments about the organization. So, I look like, what was the most damaging aspect of the Biden administration's Southeast Asia policy? Probably the president's no-show in Indonesia last year, specifically because Jakarta moved the date of the summit just to accommodate the U.S. president, and then the U.S. president didn't show up. If you don't set those expectations in the first place, then people won't be disappointed. If that hadn't happened, what we would remember is that Biden went to Jakarta for the G20, Harris went to Jakarta, and Jokowi got one of the 4 Southeast Asian state visits at the White House. But instead, people will remember that the Indonesian government bent over backwards for the U.S. president, and he didn't show.
And there was no real sort of reason that was articulated at that time that was a sort of compelling thing. I mean, I think actually, if it wasn't for the fact that the president had planned other travel to Germany and Angola, then probably people would have accepted that the presidential campaign was an adequate reason not to go. But when you're traveling then to other places, then it does make the sort of the prioritization question very clear. And, I probably take a less sunny view of US Southeast Asia engagement under the Biden administration than you, Greg. I mean, I think clearly the Philippines has been a big win. I think across the rest of the region, though, despite some good high-level engagement, there has been a kind of growing sense of disconnect for a few different reasons. And, the summit no-show, I think, reflects that.
I mean, from a Southeast Asian viewpoint, that bar was already pretty low from a few years ago, post-Obama, right? And so I think the region should just move on and stop pining over the absence or presence of a U.S. president. And we shouldn't be wasting, op-ed space talking about whether he's or she is going to be there or not. I think the world is a much changed place. And the perceptions from the region need to reflect that. But I did want to ask you, Susannah, what your expectations, if you have any, of an ASEAN-Australia bilat would be this year?
Well, Australia has always kind of made ASEAN a pretty high priority. So the Albanese government hosted all the ASEAN leaders in Melbourne earlier this year. So that was the high point. I think the challenge for Australia is that the Albanese government has made economic engagement its kind of litmus test of success, because Australian businesses have been very underinvested in the region. The problem with making that your litmus test is that the activities of Australian business are outside the jurisdiction of the Australian government, so they can try and incentivize. And in many ways, there is a parallel here with the US efforts to leverage private sector investment in support of its strategic goals, both globally and in Southeast Asia, because we can incentivize, but we can't actually direct. And so a year on since a new sort of Southeast Asia economic strategy was announced by the Albanese government, there's actually not a lot to show for it. There's not many success stories. And I think changing that is going to be quite hard.
All right, that's all the time we have for this week. Susannah, thanks so much for getting up at the crack of dawn, or maybe before the crack of dawn, to join us from Australia. Elina, thank you, as always, and thanks all of you for listening. We'll be back in another 2 weeks with the next episode of Southeast Asia Radio.
Thanks again for joining us for this episode of Southeast Asia Radio. Feel free to write us with any comments, questions, or feedback at searadio@csis.org. We'll get back to you.
Do us a favor and subscribe and give us a rating on Apple Podcasts or Spotify or whatever streaming platform that you're listening to us on. Tell your friends about us.
Marla Hiller is our producer, and our interns are Narupat Ratanikit and Natanya Sia. Our co-hosts today were Greg Poling and Elina Noor. My name is Japhet Kitson.
And I'm Lauren Mai.
And we'll see you in 2 weeks for another episode of Southeast Asia Radio.